dear students, myself Dr. Kamlesh Gakhar, Professor in Economics from Institute of Management Studies and Research, Maharishi Dayanand University, Rohtak. In the last lecture, we discussed about fiscal policy in a developing economy, limitations of fiscal policy and types of fiscal policy. In today's lecture, I am going to tell you about the impact of fiscal policy on demand side and supply side. The objective of this lecture is to enable you to understand the impact of fiscal policy on demand side, impact of fiscal policy on supply side. So, this lecture will cover meaning of expansionary fiscal policy, meaning of contractionary fiscal policy, demand side fiscal policy. In that we will discuss fiscal policy, a Keynesian perspective, crowding out, questioning the effectiveness of fiscal policy, types of crowding out the interest rate and foreign loanable funds, the new classical view of fiscal policy, crowding out with no increase in interest rates, lags and fiscal policy, crowding out, lags and effectiveness of fiscal policy, and supply side and fiscal policy, marginal tax rates and aggregate supply. Now, what is the meaning of fiscal policy? Fiscal policy refers to change in government expenditure and taxes to achieve particular economic goals. Expansionary fiscal policy refers to increase in government expenditure and or decrease in taxes. Contractionary fiscal policy refers to decrease in government expenditure and or increase in the taxes. Now, how the fiscal policy affects the demand side? An increase in G here implies government spending, increases aggregate demand and shifts aggregate demand curve to the right. A decrease in government expenditure decreases aggregate demand and shifts the aggregate demand to the left. A change in taxes can affect consumption or investment or both, and therefore, can affect aggregate demand. We know that aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government purchases. So, that is why the fiscal policy can affect the aggregate demand. A decrease in income taxes will increase disposable income, which will enable individuals to increase their consumption. As consumption rises, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. An increase in taxes will decrease disposable income, lower consumption and shift aggregate demand curve to the left. So, by changing the tax rates, aggregate demand curve can be shifted. Now, what has been the Keynesian view regarding the impact of fiscal policy on demand? Now, we will see the impact of fiscal policy on demand as was the view given by Keynes. In figure 1, we have shown how the expansionary fiscal policy can help the economy to come out of a recessionary gap. In figure 1, we have taken real gross domestic product on x axis and price level has been shown on y axis. First aggregate demand curve is AD1 and short run aggregate supply curve SRA S1 is there. Both demand and supply intersect at point 1. So, this is the point of equilibrium where the real GDP is OQ 1. Natural real GDP is OQN, or which is the optimum output, or which is also the point of full employment. But here the output is less than the output at the full employment level of income. So, to overcome this recession, aggregate demand is to be increased. So, the government adopts expansionary fiscal policy by means of increasing expenditure in the economy and reducing the tax rates, because whenever public expenditure is done, it leads to multiple times rise in income of the economy, and with rise in income people will demand more goods and services, consumption will rise. So, that would lead to increase in aggregate demand, and aggregate demand curve will shift from AD1 to AD2. Now, this is cutting the short run aggregate supply curve at point 2, which is also on the long run aggregate supply curve, and here we have reached the real output from OQ1 to OQN. Now, the optimum output has been reached. Some economists said that if the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, then also we can achieve the equilibrium 2 dash and the output will be OQN. But according to Keynes, it does not happen because there are certain bottlenecks. So, the short run supply curve does not shift to the right, and we can bring the economy out of recessionary gap by adopting expansionary fiscal policy, leading to shift in the aggregate demand curve to the rightward. Now, in figure 2, we have shown how contractionary fiscal policy can be used to control an inflationary gap. Now, again in figure 2, we have shown real GDP on x axis and price level is shown on y axis. Now, aggregate demand curve AD1 is the initial aggregate demand curve and short run aggregate supply curve is SRAS1. Both aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve are intersecting at point 1. So, this is the point of equilibrium where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply and real GDP is OQ1. Here the natural real GDP is OQN, while the present GDP OQ1 is greater than this. So, this means that there is more income with the people, aggregate demand is rising, there is inflation in the economy and inflationary gap is up to QN Q1, and we have already discussed that inflation is not considered good for the economy. It has many adverse effects on various sections. So, contractionary fiscal policy is to be adopted to bring down the aggregate demand, and in contractionary fiscal policy public expenditure is reduced and or taxes are increased. So, this will bring down the aggregate demand to AD2, and now again we have reached at the equilibrium point 2 where the output is OQN. So, thus the contractionary fiscal policy has helped the economy to come out of inflationary gap. So, dear students, we have seen how the fiscal policy can be used to bring the economy out of recession by using expansionary fiscal policy, and how we can use it to bring the economy out of inflationary gap by using contractionary fiscal policy. And we have seen how Keynes has talked of expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy for achieving the objective of bringing the economy out of recession as well as inflation. So, till now we have discussed what is the meaning of expansionary fiscal policy, what is the meaning of contractionary fiscal policy, and what is the impact of fiscal policy on demand side from the point of view of Keynes. Now, we will discuss what is crowding out. Crowding out actually questions the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Now, what is crowding out? Crowding out refers to a decrease in private expenditure, consumption, investment and so on that occurs as a consequence of increased government spending or the financing needs of a deficit budget. Examples of crowding out are: number 1, the government spends more on education and individuals spend less on private education. The government spends more on public libraries and individual buy fewer books at bookstores. The government spends more on transportation and individuals spend less on private transport. The government spends more on social programs and defense without raising taxes. As a result, the size of deficit increases. Consequently, the government has to borrow more funds to finance the larger deficit. Demand for credit or loanable funds rises, resulting in higher rate of interest. Investment declines due to increase in the rate of interest. So, increase in government spending induces consumers and investors to spend less. Government spending crowd out private investment directly, as in example from 1 to 3, or indirectly example 4. Now, what are the types of crowding out? There are 3 types of crowding out. Number 1 is zero crowding out. When there is no crowding out, it is called zero crowding out. This means due to increase in the government expenditure, there is no decrease in the private investment. The other is complete crowding out. In complete crowding out, decrease in private investment completely offsets the increase in government spending. Incomplete crowding out occurs when the decrease in one or more components of private spending partially offsets the increase in government spending. In figure 3, we have shown the impact of crowding out on fiscal policy. We have shown real GDP on x axis and price level is shown on y axis. Initially, there is aggregate demand AD1, it is cutting short run aggregate supply curve 1 at point 1. So, equilibrium is at point 1 and real GDP is OQ1. Now, the natural rate of real GDP is OQN, which is on long run aggregate supply curve. Now, the country wants to move from 1 to point 2 to have the natural real GDP level, and expansionary fiscal policy is adopted. If there is no crowding out or zero crowding out, then aggregate demand curve shifts from AD1 to to AD2 and the equilibrium is at point 2 where the real GDP is OQN. So, when there is zero crowding out, fiscal policy is completely effective, but when there is incomplete crowding out, then AD curve shifts to AD dash 2 and here the equilibrium is at 2 dash and the level of real GDP is OQ dash 2. Now, again this is less than the natural rate of real GDP, but it is more than the GDP OQ1. If there is a complete crowding out, then the AD1 curve will remain the same, it will not shift at all and economy will remain at equilibrium number 1, making the fiscal policy completely ineffective. So, in this diagram we have seen how the aggregate demand will shift or not, it will depend upon whether the crowding out is 0, it is complete or it is incomplete. Now, we will see what is crowding out, the interest rate and foreign loanable funds. We have seen how rise in rate of interest because of the increased demand for credit on account of larger deficit leads to fall in private investment. But if high rate of interest attracts loanable funds from abroad, what will happen to the crowding out? When the country receives foreign funds because of high interest rates, supply of credit will rise and in that case interest will not rise. For buying the securities of the country, for example, India, foreigners will demand more of the rupees and this will raise the value of rupees in foreign market. Appreciation of Indian currency will reduce India's exports and increase its imports, and if there is already trade deficit in India, it will become larger. So, we find that increase in government spending can lead to decline in consumption, investment and net exports. Increase in government spending can affect a budget deficit, interest rates, value of home currency in terms of other currencies, imports and exports and trade deficit. Till now we have discussed crowding out, how it questions the effectiveness of fiscal policy, meaning and examples of crowding out, types of crowding out as zero crowding out, complete crowding out and incomplete crowding out, the interest rate and foreign loanable funds, crowding out, impact of government spending. Now, we will see the new classical view of fiscal policy, crowding out with no increase in the interest rates. The new classical economists believe that in response to expansionary fiscal policy and larger deficits, individuals think that larger deficit implies more debt that year and higher future taxes. So, they start saving more and consuming less. So, what are the predictions of new classical economists? Current consumption will fall as a result of expansionary fiscal policy, because people will start saving more to pay future taxes which will be higher than the present times. Deficits do not bring higher interest rates, increased saving, increase the supply of credit and offsets the increased demand for credit. This is being shown in the figure 4 and figure 5. In figure 4, real GDP is shown on x axis, price level is shown on y axis. Short run aggregate supply curve, this is SRAS1 going upward, aggregate demand curve is AD1, and originally the economy is at equilibrium number 1, where the real GDP is OQ1 and price level is OP1. Now, if expansionary fiscal policy is adopted and it is expected that aggregate demand curve will shift to the right as AD2, but according to the new classical economists, aggregate demand will not rise because people will reduce consumption, they will save more because they are thinking they will have to pay more taxes in the future. So, expansionary fiscal policy will not lead to any shift in the aggregate demand curve and equilibrium will be at the same point, it will remain at 0.1. So, AD2 will not materialize. In figure 5, it has been shown how the rate of interest will remain same. We have shown the loanable funds on x axis. D1 is the first demand curve for loanable funds and S1 is the supply of loanable funds and equilibrium is at 0.1, where the rate of interest is OI1. Demand for and supply of loanable funds is OL1 in this situation. Now, with the expansionary fiscal policy, if demand for loanable funds rises as D2 because of the increased deficit, but people start saving more and consuming less. So, with increased saving, now the saving curve has shifted from S1 to S2 and equilibrium is at 0.2, where the demand for loanable funds and supply of loanable funds has increased from OL1 to OL2, but the rate of interest remains same. So, this was the point of view given by the new classical economist regarding the change in aggregate demand and regarding whether there will be change in the interest rate or not. Thus, it can be said that as long as expansionary fiscal policy is translated into higher future taxes, there will be no change in real GDP, unemployment, the price level and interest rates. This analysis also holds for contractionary fiscal policy. Now, we will talk about lags and fiscal policy. We have already talked of lags of fiscal policy in the previous lecture. We talked of the 5 types of the fiscal lags. They were the data lag, wait and see lag, legislative lag, transmission lag and effectiveness lag. So, if there are lags, how they make the fiscal policy ineffective, this is shown in the next figure. In figure 6, we have shown real GDP on x axis, price level is shown on y axis, the original aggregate demand curve is AD1 and short run aggregate supply curve is SRAS1 and economy is in equilibrium at 0.1. This is the starting point and equilibrium GDP is OQ1. Now, the objective of the economy is to reach at 0.1 dash, where we have the natural rate of real GDP, that is OQN. So, aggregate demand is expected to be shifted to AD2 by making use of expansionary fiscal policy. When the economy is at OQ1, there is a recessionary gap from OQ1 to OQN. So, due to expansionary fiscal policy, which means increase in the public expenditure or decrease in the taxes, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right as AD2 and the economy is expected to be at equilibrium 1 dash, but actually what happens due to the increased expenditure, there is deficit financing in the economy and supply is increased and the supply curve now shifts to the SRAS2 and the equilibrium is now shifted to 0.2 where the new aggregate demand curve AD2 and aggregate supply curve SRAS2 are intersecting each other. Now, economy ends up here. Here the real GDP is OQ2 which is more than the natural real GDP OQN. So, this is inflationary gap. So, what we find that it was expected that economy will move from 0.1 to 1 dash, but the result is from 1 to 2 where there is inflation in the economy. So, the objective has not been fulfilled because of the lags, because time has elapsed between finding out whether there is a need for fiscal policy, taking the action and even after implementation. So, due to the lags, the economy ends up in the inflationary situation. So, if there are lags in the fiscal policy, they make the fiscal policy ineffective. So, the economists who believe that there is a zero crowding out and lags are insignificant, they conclude that fiscal policy is effective at moving the economy out of recession. And the economists who believe that there is a complete crowding out or that lags are significant conclude that fiscal policy is ineffective at moving the economy out of a recessionary gap. Now, we will discuss what is the effect of fiscal policy on supply side. Fiscal policy affects the supply side of the economy as well. For example, a reduction in tax rates may alter an individual's incentive to work and produce, thus altering the aggregate supply. Marginal tax rates affect the aggregate supply. Now, what is this marginal tax rate? Marginal tax rate is equal to delta tax payment divided by delta taxable income, and delta is for change. For example, if Shyam's taxable income rises by rupee 1 and his tax payment increases by rupees 0.28, his marginal tax is 28%. If his taxable income rises by rupees 1 and his tax payment increases by rupees 0.35, then his marginal tax rate is 35%. Other things remaining the same, lower marginal tax rates increase the incentive to engage in productive activities relative to layer and tax avoidance activities. This shifts the short run aggregate supply curve. If lower marginal tax rates are permanent, even long run aggregate supply curve also shifts to the right. So, thus marginal tax rates are going to affect the aggregate supply curve. Figure 7 shows the predicted effect of a permanent marginal tax rate cut on aggregate supply. It is assumed here that due to fall in marginal tax rates, people work more. Now, in figure 7, real GDP is shown on x axis, price level has been shown on y axis. SRAS1 short run aggregate supply curve 1 and aggregate demand curve 1 are intersecting at point 1, and here it is also being intersected by long run aggregate supply curve 1, and the economy is at the level of full employment and having the real GDP OQN 1. Now, because of the change in the tax rates and because of the fall in marginal tax rates, what happens? People start working more. So, this leads to increase in the short run aggregate supply curve and it shifts to the right. Now, the SRAS2 is there and it is cutting aggregate demand 1 at point 2, and now the real GDP has increased to QN 2, and here full employment level has also increased. And if this change in marginal tax rates is permanent, then even long run aggregate supply curve also shifts to the right, and again we are at equilibrium and the level of real GDP is OQN 2 and economy has achieved the optimum output. So, this shows that the permanent marginal tax rate cut affects both short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply and they shift rightward. So, in this lecture we have discussed the meaning of expansionary fiscal policy, meaning of contractionary fiscal policy. We have discussed the demand side fiscal policy from Keynesian point of view. We have seen what is crowding out, what are the examples of crowding out, what are the types of crowding out which have been zero crowding out, complete crowding out and incomplete crowding out. What is the relationship between crowding out, interest rate and foreign loanable funds? Crowding out impact of government spending has also been discussed. We also discussed the new classical view of the fiscal policy, crowding out with no increase in interest rates. We have also seen how the lags in the fiscal policy make it ineffective. Crowding out, lags and effectiveness of the fiscal policy has been talked. Supply side of the fiscal policy has also been talked upon and we discussed how there is effect on aggregate supply because of the marginal tax rates. I hope all of you have understood this lecture clearly. In the next lecture, we will discuss impact of government expenditure and taxes on national income. Thanks.